Before we begin today's story, we need to understand what it is about. What is this story ultimately about? We can find the answer in verse 1. Verse 1 For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. This story is ultimately about what the kingdom of heaven is like. Jesus told this story to explain what heaven is. What do you think of when you hear the word heaven? Today's message will give us the answer. Today's story explains the lesson using work, something everyone can easily understand. There was a landowner who wanted to hire workers for his vineyard. He first made an agreement with the workers, promising to pay them 1 denarius for their labor. He set the wage clearly. Verse 2 says, he agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and send them into his vineyard. The landowner must have told the workers, I will pay you 1 denarius to work in my vineyard. The workers agreed to the wages and went to work in the vineyard. The landowner went out early in the morning to hire the first group of workers. Verse 1 says, he went out early in the morning, which was probably right after sunrise. Since this is spring and the sunrise is a bit later, we can estimate this to be around 7 a.m. He found some workers and said to them, I will pay you 1 denarius if you work in my vineyard. The workers agreed and went to work. Then landowner went out again at the 3rd hour to find more workers. In today's time, the 3rd hour would be 9 a.m. When he went to the marketplace, he saw people standing around with no work to do. So the vineyard owner brought them to work as well. Later, the landowner went out again to hire more workers. He went to marketplace at the 6th hour and the 9th hour to find more workers. What time is the 6th hour? That's right. If we add 6 plus 6, we get 12. So the 6th hour is 12 p.m. And what about the 9th hour? The 9th hour is 3 p.m. Just as he had done in the morning, the landowner went out again at noon to hire more workers. Then at 3 p.m., he went out once more to bring in more workers. By now, it seems like the landowner has hired enough workers, but surprisingly, he goes out again at the 11th hour. What time is the 11th hour? It is 5 p.m. According to the later verses, the last group of workers only worked for 1 hour. This means the workday ended at 6 p.m. By 5 p.m., there was hardly any time left to work, so it didn't seem necessary to hire more workers. Yet, the landowner went out once more. And again, in the marketplace, he found people still standing idle because no one had hired them. Who are these people? They were probably the ones no one wanted to hire, people who seemed weak, sick, unskilled. They might have been the less important, the exhausted, the broken, or those who had a bad reputation for being lazy or unreliable. These were the ones left behind, overlooked, and unwanted. The landowner heard these people say, no one has hired us, so we are still standing here. Even though the landowner could probably guess why they were still left, maybe they were not good at working or had a bad reputation. He still told them to go and work in his vineyard. Perhaps he needed more workers, or maybe he simply had a generous heart. Let's read the verses 6 to 7. About the 11th hour, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." What do you think the workers who came earliest thought when they saw the last ones coming in? If you were in their place, how would you feel? The one who entered the vineyard first had woken up early in the morning. They had worked hard from dawn, being diligent for their own livelihood. When the landowner was hiring workers, they probably raised their hands eagerly, saying, "Pick me." They wanted to prove that they could work better than anyone else. For those only workers, seeing a few slow-moving, unskilled people arrive with only 1 hour left in the workday might have made them feel a sense of superiority. Some of them might have been criticized the landowner, thinking, "What a foolish decision. Why would he bring in workers who can barely work and only for 1 hour?" They might have scoffed, saying, "He owns a vineyard, but he sure isn't very smart." Now the time has finally come to receive the wages. The landowner begins by paying the last group of workers first. And here comes the twist. What happens next is unexpected. The workers who arrived last, those whom no one wanted to hire because they were inefficient and skilled, and who only worked for 1 hour, received the 1 denarius. Let's read verse 9. The workers who were hired about 11th hour came and each received a denarius. Seeing this, the first workers, the ones who were hired early in the morning, must have been thrilled. If those who worked only 1 hour received the 1 denarius, how much should the first workers receive? A simple calculation suggests that since they worked about 11 hours, they should receive 11 denarius. But we already know the answer. How much did the first workers actually receive? Let's read verse 10. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. I have a very good personality, but when I feel that something is unfair, I found it hard to stay silent. I tend to speak up right away, and honestly, sometimes I know I should be more patient, but it's not easy for me. So if I were one of the first workers, I wouldn't be able to stay quiet. I would feel that this situation was completely unfair. That's why I totally understand the complaints in verses 11 to 12. Let's read 11 to 12 verse 11. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of work at the heat of day. When the landowner heard their complaints, he responded, Didn't you and I agree on 1 denarius? I gave exactly what I promised. So why are you upset with me? Let's read verse 13 to 15. But he answered one of them, I am not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired less the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? Now, how do you think first workers reacted after hearing this? If you had been in their place, how do you feel? How would you have felt? If you had heard these words, would you have responded like this? Oh, right. We did agree on one denarius. I must have misunderstood. Well, since it's your money, you can do whatever you want with it. I was wrong to complain. I should have known my place. I'm sorry. Would you really have said that? If I had heard these words, I might not have been able to find the right words to respond, but I would never have worked in that vineyard again. I would have wanted nothing to do with that landowner ever again. In fact, I would have tried to get back at him by warning others. Hey, I worked at this vineyard once. And guess what? Whether you start early or late, he pays everyone the same. One denarius. So don't bother going there early. Just go at the last minute. Just because I heard the landowner's explanation in verses 13 to 15 doesn't mean my anger would have disappeared or that I would have been convinced that it was fair. The most frustrating moment in a conflict is when the other person only speaks facts, leaving me with nothing to say in response. And isn't landowner's response especially hurtful? He said, don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? What does it matter to you? These words completely shut down any argument. It's like pouring fuel on the fire. What we see here is that the landowner was never interested in giving the first workers the answer they wanted. So, this story is not about how the first workers were eventually convinced by the landowner's words. The story doesn't tell us what happened afterward, but the logical conclusion is this. The first workers never worked for that landowner again. They left with resentment toward to the landowner. And that's how we should understand this parable, not as a resolution, but as a lesson in reversal. That's why Jesus ends the story with verse 16. So the last will first, and the first will be last. How do you feel after hearing this story? Do you feel sense of relief, like a burden has been lifted from your heart? Does it all make perfect sense, leaving you think, oh, of course, now I get it. This is so satisfying. What did we say this parable ultimately reveals? The kingdom of heaven. Does this story make you immediately think, yes, of course, this is exactly how heaven should be? Probably not. If this story doesn't bother you at all, if you feel no tension or frustration, then you are either someone who fully understands this parable or someone as wealthy as the vineyard owner. If neither of these applies, then this story will likely feel unfair and difficult to accept. The landowner's words not wrong, but From the perspective of the first workers, they seem like pure explanation, a display of power and authority. So why would Jesus tell such a strange story? Why does he say the kingdom of heaven is like this vineyard owner? This landowner is not logical by human standards. It is common sense that those who work more should be paid more. But the landowner did not follow this principle. His actions were unreasonable and unfair. And that's not all. Why did he bother hiring workers 1 hour before the workday ended? Why did he bring in people who were clearly unfit for vineyard work? Do you see where this is going? Do you now understand why Jesus compared this landowner to the kingdom of heaven? The key message of this parable is this: heaven is not a place of logic, fairness, or human reasoning. The kingdom of heaven does not operate by our sense of justice, equality, or rationality. This landowner is ultimate symbol of irrationality, unpredictability, and unfairness. He does whatever he wants with no objective standards and no clear qualification for who gets to enter his vineyard. If a vineyard were managed like this in real life, it wouldn't last long. Soon, only the wrong kinds of works would show up. People might say, hey, if you go to there, you get paid a denarius for just 1 hour of work. The vineyard would attract only the weak, the lazy, and the incapable. And since they get paid regardless of how much they work, they wouldn't even bother putting in effort. They would probably just pretend to work for an hour or two, keep an eye on the landowner, and wait to collect their denarius. Although this specific scenario isn't mentioned in the parable, we can easily imagine it happening. So, in some ways, this landowner seems foolish. He seems like someone who is making a bad business decision, a person who doesn't know how to manage his own wealth properly. If this landowner had been just a little smarter, more rational, more reasonable, he never would have hired workers after noon. If he more practical, then when he went to market to sell his harvested grapes, he might have still seen people wandering around looking for work, but instead of hiring them, he would have just shaken his head and walked away. Unlike the landowner in the parable, a rational vineyard owner wouldn't even bother asking them, why are you still standing here without work? And what if one of these unskilled, unwanted workers came up to him and begged, sir, please let me work, give me a chance? What would a rational, efficient landowner say? He would immediately dismiss them. Get lost. You think you can work in my vineyard? You are worthless. Go away. If the landowner had been more rational and reasonable, he still would have given 1 denarius to the workers who started early in the morning, since he had made a clear contract with them. However, for workers who came at 9 a.m., 12 p.m., 3 p.m., and 5 p.m., he would have paid them much less instead of giving them the same wage. If a worker who started at 9 a.m. received much less than 1 denarius and complained that it was smaller than expected, the landowner could have simply said, I told you I would pay you fairly, but I never said how much. This is my money, and I can do whatever I want with it. Why are you making such a fuss? Since Jesus said that landowner represent the kingdom of heaven, let's think about this. What if heaven were more rational? What if heaven operated based on fairness, logic, and reason? What would happen to us? If God, the owner of heaven, used his wisdom to carefully examine everything about us, if he opened the gates of heaven in a way that seemed completely fair and reasonable to everyone, if he granted salvation only through a logical and just system, what would happen to us? Jesus would never have come to this earth. In fact, we might not even exist at all. And even if we did exist, not a single one of us would be able to have a relationship with God. And not one of us would enter eternal heaven. If God were purely rational and heaven operated on fairness, he would carefully calculate every action and reward us accordingly. In that case, we wouldn't even get a chance to work in the vineyard, let alone receive any reward. More than that, we would all be left outside the vineyard weeping forever. But today, Jesus tells us something incredible. The kingdom of heaven is like this vineyard owner, a landowner who, foolish by human standards, welcomes everyone inside, a landowner who invites those who seem unworthy, a landowner who rewards even those who don't deserve it. And because heaven is like this, we are here today. Because heaven does not operate on strict logic, fairness, or merit, we have the hope of salvation. If God had measured us with the scale of logic and reason, we wouldn't be here today. But instead, God says, even if you are unworthy, it is my will to give you a denarius. That's why we have a hope. The owner of heaven, our God, is illogical by human standards. He is irrational in his mercy, and in the greatest act of what seems like foolish, he died on the cross. Why? So that those like us, those who were left standing in the marketplace, unable to find work, overlooked and rejected, would hear him say, "Why are you standing here doing nothing? Come, I will give you work. Enter my vineyard." And even though we have done nothing, he gives us our wages, eternal life. That is our God. Just as we can guess how the story might continue, the first worker who started only in the morning would never have respected the vineyard owner again. Instead, they likely spoke badly of him behind his back. On the other hand, the workers who came at last hour would have honored, rejoiced in, and loved the vineyard owner. Why? Because they received grace. So, who truly belongs in heaven? It is not those who believe, I deserve salvation, I have lived well, I've worked hard of God, I have prayed, worshipped, and sacrificed. So, God should listen to my prayers, answer me, and treat me fairly. These people cannot understand God. Instead, those who belong in heaven are like the workers who arrived at the last hour. When they open their wage envelope and they see a full denarius in their hands, while the first workers call these ways illogical, unfair, and unreasonable. The last workers do not. Instead, a question fills their minds. Why would I receive this? I only work it for 1 hour. I don't deserve this. This is grace. The ones who feel best in heaven are those who know deep in their hearts, I have received freely what I could never earn. We can understand this even more clearly when we look at the question that started this story. Before Jesus told this parable, Peter asked him a question. Jesus, we have left everything to follow you. What will we receive? What does this question mean? It means Peter saw himself as one of the first workers. Let's read Matthew chapter 19, 27 verse. Verse 27. Peter answered him, we have left everything to follow you. What then will there be for us? Why is Peter asking this? He is essentially saying, shouldn't we receive more? Haven't we worked hard? Haven't we followed you more from the beginning? There was no one before us, so surely we deserve more, right? And through this parable, Jesus answers Peter very clearly. Who does the kingdom of heaven belong to? It belongs to those who understand grace, those who believe they have earned their place before God, those who think they deserve more, those who demand fairness. These are the ones who have nothing to do with heaven. The vineyard owner doesn't bother explaining or convincing the first workers. He doesn't try to win their approval. And after this, they never work for him again. Jesus is saying, do you think you are first? You will be last. Do you think you are last? You will be first. So, if we are a citizen of heaven, our true identity is this. I am someone who knows grace. If we truly belong to heaven, we see ourselves as the worker who came at the 5th hour. No matter how hard I have worked in my life, no matter how successful or respectable I seem to others, no matter how morally upright and honorable my life may appear, when we look at ourselves, we must confess, I was unworthy. No one would have hired me. I had nothing to offer. If we are a citizen of heaven, we must confess, I am here only because of God's grace. I am here because He called me, because He invited me in at the last hour, because He gave me what I did not deserve. This is what it means to know grace, the true identity of a citizen of heaven. This is what happens when someone truly knows grace. When they see themselves as last-minute workers who barely made it in at 5 p.m. So, what's their biggest trait? They don't judge others based on logic, fairness, or reason, because they know just how unfairly generous the grace they received was. They don't go around criticizing other people's weakness, because they know they are sinners too. They don't harshly call out others for their fairness, because they've received a completely unreasonable, undeserved salvation. They can turn around and judge others based on what seems fair. I'm sure you know people who like this. People who seem a little foolish, but are full of grace. People who don't get caught up in fairness and logic, but instead find joy in showing grace. People who know the beauty of stepping back and letting others win, who could easily complain when treated unfairly but don't. People who take on difficult things even when they don't have to, as if they don't mind looking like fools. But let's be real, they are not actually fools. It's not that they don't know better. They know exactly how the world works. They understand what's fair and what's not. But they let things go. Why? Because they've been given grace. And that grace is so overwhelming, so undeserved, that it makes them want to pass it on to others. So, how do people who have received grace see each other? They see through the lens of grace, like they've got grace colored glasses on. Everything looks different because grace changed the way they see. I hope our community becomes a kingdom minded community. Of course, there will be times when we don't know what to say. There will be moments when others prostrate us. When we look at people through our own standards, we'll naturally see flaws, shortcomings, and gaps. But even then, I hope we can see each other through the lens of grace. Not just any grace, but the completely unreasonable, illogical, overwhelming grace of God's salvation. Because we have experienced that grace, I hope we can extend that same grace to another. I want to end today's sermon by sharing a story from my time in ministry that connects to today's message. Back when I was serving in a church, I was in charge of young adult ministry. It was a large church and we had a lot of young adults gathering. In our ministry, those who had gone through faith training became small group leaders. Each leader was responsible for a small group, leading Bible studies and discipleship. And above them, we had senior leaders. We called them village leaders, who oversaw multiple small groups. These senior leaders were in many ways my closest co-workers, almost like the pastor's right-hand team. But as in any church, there were always conflicts, misunderstandings, and hurts. People got hurt by one another. People felt left out, overlooked, unappreciated. And these tensions, as you can imagine, affected even the closest leaders. There was a young woman in our ministry who at one point had a small conflict with another member. It was honestly a very minor issue, and to help resolve it, one of the village leaders stepped in. She tried to meditate, listen, and bring understanding between the two. But somehow, instead of resolving the issues, things escalated. The young woman felt that village leaders wasn't taking her side, so she started spreading negative rumors about village leader in the community. At the point, as the pastor, I had to step in and personally address the situation. I sat down with the village leader who had been caught in the middle of it all. We talked about what has happened, and I told her, I will call her in and rebuke her directly. I felt responsible for protecting my leaders, but then something happened that I will never forget. As soon as I said that, the village leader started crying. Tears rolled down her face, as she looked at me and said, Pastor, I think I can just let this go. It's okay. I'm okay. If someone insults me, isn't it natural to insult them back? If someone attacks me, isn't it only fair to defend myself and fight back? That's how the world works, right? So why did that village leader sit there crying and say it's okay? Why didn't she demand justice? Why didn't she say, Pastor, this is unfair. I'm hurt. Please do something. Why did she have nothing to say? That moment changed the way I saw ministry. It set a new standard for me. I realized that I need to become a fool. I have received a foolish love, so I must become a fool for love. And that is my prayer for this church. I want all of us to become fools, not because we are weak, but because God, in His foolish love, accepted us without conditions. Not because we don't understand fairness, but because God didn't treat us based on fairness. If we stop looking at each other through the world's standards and instead see each other through the lens of grace, if we become fools who let things go, who choose grace over fairness, then our church will become a kingdom community. Let's pray.